Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Shara May de Los Santos, and I have titled this presentation Too Much, Too Soon, Screen Time Exposure in the First 2 Years of Life. And this is based off of the study by Brushe and his colleagues' study called Objectively Measured Infants and Toddler Screen Time Findings from a Prospective Study from 2023. Screen exposure during early childhood is increasingly recognized as a critical public health issue. Despite recommendations from both the World Health Organization and the Australian government that children under 2 years old should not be exposed to screen media, research has shown that infants and toddlers are often introduced to digital devices well before this age. The concern arises because early exposure to screens has been linked to a range of developmental challenges, including language delays, reduced cognitive growth, and socio-emotional difficulties. Most of the existing research, however, relies on parental self-report, which is vulnerable to bias and underreporting. Brushe and his colleagues from 2023 sought to address this gap by employing objective measurements of screen exposure in infants and toddlers, while also investigating how patterns of screen use may vary by maternal education and child gender. This focus is significant because identifying social demographic disparities in early life screen use may help explain broader inequalities in child health and development later in life. The study had two primary objectives. First, the authors aimed to quantify the amount of screen exposure among infants and toddlers at 4 developmental stages: 6, 12, 18, and 24 months of age. By using objective measures, they intended to provide more reliable estimates of exposure than studies that rely on parental recall. Second, they sought to determine whether disparities in screen use exist on the basis of maternal education and child gender, and whether such disparities persist or change as children grow older. Brushe and his colleagues hypothesized that exposure would increase with age, be higher in children from lower education households, and show little difference between boys and girls. The study's population consisted of infants and toddlers born in 2017 across South Australia, Western Australia, and Queensland. Eligible participants were required to be full-term singletons, to come from households where English was predominantly spoken, and to have no diagnosed language impairments at the time of recruitment. These criteria ensured consistency in data collection, but also placed limits on the generalizability of findings. As a result, the conclusions are most directly applicable to healthy English-speaking Australian families, and they may not extend to children born preterm, to households where multiple languages are spoken, or to children living in low-resource settings outside of Australia. Brushe and his colleagues employed a prospective longitudinal cohort design. Infants were enrolled and followed over time, with screen exposure measured at 4 developmental points between 6 and 24 months of age. Because no intervention was actually applied, the study was observational rather than experimental. This design was well suited to the authors' goals because it allowed them to track changes in exposure across time within the same group of children, while also comparing patterns between groups defined by maternal education and gender. The sample for the study was drawn from families already participating in the Larger Language in Little Ones LILO project, with Brushe and his colleagues' analysis forming part of the Nested Electronic Use in Little Ones, or UWILO, study. At 6 months of age, 177 families contributed data, and by 24 months, the sample had expanded to 207 families. The authors did not conduct a formal sample size or power calculation, which is typical of analysis based on existing cohorts. Families were originally recruited into the LILO study during the antenatal and postnatal periods across 3 Australian states, and they were later invited to participate in the UWILO sub-study. To be eligible, infants had to be full-term singletons from English-speaking households with no known language impairments. Families with preterm infants, multi-births, or non-English-speaking homes were excluded. Randomization was not applicable to this observational study. Instead of a control group, the study relied on comparisons between groups, specifically those defined by maternal education, which is high versus low, and gender, while also describing demographic differences across these categories. The authors of the study used both descriptive and multivariate statistical methods. At the descriptive level, they calculated means and standard deviation for daily screen exposure and presented the distributions graphically. They also reported the percentage of children at each age who met the recommended guidelines of zero screen exposure. For more advanced analysis, they applied random effects linear mixed models, which accounted for repeated measures from the same children across 4 time points. These models included fixed effects for age, maternal education, and gender, as well as interaction terms to test whether differences between groups changed over time. From these models, the authors estimated predicted means with 95% confidence intervals and reported significant levels using p-values. This approach allowed them to distinguish overall trends in screen exposure from disparities related to socio-demographic factors. The univariate results showed that screen exposure began early and rose steadily over time. At 6 months, infants were exposed to an average of 1 hour and 16 minutes of screen media per day. By 24 months, average exposure had nearly doubled to 2 hours and 28 minutes per day. Correspondingly, the proportions of children meeting the recommended guidelines of zero screen time decreased from 11.3% at 6 months to only 2.4% at 24 months. Now, the multivariate analysis reinforced these patterns while also highlighting socioeconomic disparities. After adjusting for repeated measures and stratifying by maternal education, the authors of the study found that children from high education households had significantly less screen exposure than those from low educated households. At 6 months, this gap amounted to approximately 102 minutes per day, and although it narrowed over time, a difference of about 45 minutes remained at 24 months. Gender differences were minimal. Girls had slightly more screen exposure than boys at 6 months, which is about 12 minutes more, but this difference diminished to around 5 minutes by 24 months, a difference too small to be considered meaningful in the study. Findings led the authors to several important conclusions. They determined that the majority of Australian infants and toddlers are exposed to screens much earlier than recommended, and that screen time increases rapidly during the first 2 years of life. They also showed that socioeconomic disparities, particularly those tied to maternal education, are already present at 6 months and remain evident into toddlerhood, while gender differences are minimal. I agree with these conclusions because they are supported by rigorous study designs and aligned with broader literature. For example, Madigan et al. 2019 reported that greater screen exposure in early childhood predicted poorer performance on later development assessments. Similarly, Stiglick and Viner from 2019 found that the higher levels of screen time were associated with multiple health harms for children and young people, including increased adiposity, unhealthy diets, depressive symptoms, and lower quality of life. Additional evidence from Dutch et al. From 2013 reinforces Brushe et al.'s observations by identifying key correlates of screen use in infants and toddlers. In their review of 29 studies, Dutch and colleagues found that other child-age minority race ethnicity had higher maternal distress or depression and had greater maternal television viewing, which were strongly associated with more child screen time. Now, the study had some limitations. Audio-based devices may miss silent screens use or misclassify background noise. The sample excluded preterm infants, twins, and non-English households, limiting generalizability. Only maternal education and gender were examined, so other socioeconomic factors may also play a role. Finally, exposure was measured on a single average day, which might not capture typical patterns. The best design would be a large prospective cohort following infants from birth, using objective tools to capture screen use and monitor outcomes like language, sleep, and growth. This approach would make the results more generalizable and provide stronger evidence of how early screen time affects development. Now, ending this presentation, this study provides clear evidence that infants are exposed to substantial screen time in their first 2 years of life, despite guidelines recommending none. It highlights persistent socioeconomic differences in exposure and underscores the importance of supporting parents in reduced early screen use. While not measuring outcomes directly, the research makes a strong case for addressing screen time as a public health priority. Thank you so much.